Hi, we enter into Acts 9 today and engage perhaps one of the most consequential historical reports in all of Western history, where an obscure character, Saul, a Pharisee, a member of a despised and marginalized group of Judeans amidst the powerful Roman Empire, out in the seeming middle of nowhere, somewhere between Jerusalem and Damascus, sees a bright light from the sky and is transformed. Not necessarily as you might imagine, but certainly transformed. And his transformation led to the spread of a message that otherwise might well have remained confined to narrow confines around the Mediterranean area where Jesus lived. It's already gone out, at least to the south of the region, although it didn't get to Ethiopia, and it hasn't gone much farther than that. But Saul will take it all the way to Rome and all around the Mediterranean and be the one who really makes the message of Jesus a force throughout the Roman Empire. And so Luke is reporting this event to us, and three times, once here in chapter 9 and twice in memory. And I won't look at the comparisons now because I want to stay with how Luke unwinds the story here and just look at our first version of it. I also won't compare it to Saul's or Paul's own writings in his own letters because, again, just like the story of who he is and not just how this happened, I want to confine it to how Luke tells the story. So this is not going to be a series of videos about the historical Paul, but about the character in the book of Acts as we see it unfold on the left side of the screen. So as we've been following in this unit from 8.1 to 9.31, I've been looking at these questions here. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, I encourage you to do so, where I go over all of these in general. But now we're on this scene down here, starting in verse 9, or question 9 and question 10, and we'll look at these others as we go. Saul seeks authority from the high priest in the form of letters to the synagogues in Damascus. What do we know about such authority and the state of things in Damascus as Saul heads there? And what scriptural echoes do we hear in the description of Saul's epiphany that we see here, although none are cited, just unlike what we saw in the previous scene where the eunuch was reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and we saw a quote, at least from the narrator of that here. Here, the scripture quotes are implicit in the background. We look at the shape of our scene, although most scholars don't make this a chiastic shape. I tend to find those, and scholars want to argue about chiasms being found if they're not there, but you can decide if they're there by seeing the parallels. So here in 1 to 8 is all we'll look at now. It starts with them on the way to Damascus and ends with them in Damascus. Suddenly there's a light, and then we're seeing because of that light he could see nothing. He fell to the earth, then he got up from the earth, and in the middle is the message from the risen Jesus about what he's to do. So that certainly seems like it makes sense chiastically with both the message of the risen Christ at the center, but also Paul's experience surrounding that. And then we'll see there's another chiasm about his transformation from being blind to and on a fast to seeing and eating, and then we'll see another little ABA one there as well. I only went through verse 31 in chapter 9 because after that the scene shifts back to Peter and really sets up the story with Peter and Cornelius that will follow in chapters 10 and 11. So the chapter markers are placed much later than the text was written. We'll just take this section in mind. And as I was noting at the very beginning here, there are a number of presuppositions that you may carry, that many people carry about this. First of all, he did not fall off a horse. And despite these images that you can see here, one after another of Renaissance art, he's always on the horse. It's hard to find him not on one, but he was not on a horse. There's nothing in the description of that. And a horse is a war animal, not a travel animal in any event. If he was riding, he might be like his namesake predecessor, Saul, who was out starting his journey back in 1 Samuel 9 looking for lost donkeys. But there's no description of any animals here, donkeys or horses. And as far as we know, he walked the many thousands of miles that he walked in his many decades of taking the message around the Mediterranean. So no horse. Perhaps more importantly, the story that he converted from Jew to Christian. And I can't underscore enough, I've been doing it throughout, there's nothing in Acts or his letters that ever says this, nor is it imaginable to a man like Saul, that he could go from being a Pharisee and a zealous enforcer of his traditions. No one is more zealous for that than he was in the story here, willing to kill other people for his theology and willing to take all his time, not getting paid for it, to enforce his view of things. But the idea that he could switch to another religion is like saying to a black person you could become a white person. It's not like saying to a male you could become a female. That in our world is imaginable and doesn't involve any sense of betraying a group as such, because we don't necessarily gather as gender larger groups, especially since procreation requires some form of interaction. But certainly Judeans tended to be isolated from other peoples, and they certainly would not have imagined themselves becoming another kind of person in relation to God. Certainly some of them, and we know the struggle all the way back to the time of the book of Maccabees, felt it was valuable to engage other cultures, especially the Greek culture and later the Roman culture. But that wouldn't mean they would stop being Judeans or stop being Israelites. It just means they would be incorporating that in there. So the later Christian sense that Saul Paul could change from being a Jew to Christian is just simply nonsense, and there's nothing in the story that supports it. Similarly, along with that is the false understanding that his name was changed, perhaps by God, from Saul to Paul. But that's not so either. And as you can see from my note on the left side from Saul, it's not until chapter 13, verse 9, where we can see it here, Saul, a.k.a. Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit. Notice it's not saying he changed his name, also known as. And that was not unusual in a multicultural environment, as it's not unusual now. I know, and maybe you know, many people from other cultures, Asian cultures especially, whose first names might be uncomfortable or unfamiliar to Western-oriented people. So they take on a Western-sounding name to make it easier for others to receive them, but perhaps back in their home culture, they go by their given name. And that's a common thing throughout the ages. So there's no sense that he changed his name or something like a baptismal name. His birth name is the biblical name Shaul, which he shares with the first king, in speaking of the books of Samuel. And then in Roman circles, he went by Paulus, which means small from the Latin, and we won't get there till chapter 13. Another issue that's really important here, and this relates to the question of going from Jew to Christian, but it's a subset of that, and again, it's very important, that his conversion led him to place Torah in opposition to the gospel. And again, there's nothing whatsoever to support that, either here in Acts or in his letters, not even in places like Romans or Galatians, where Protestant scholars want to enforce their view of things over against Catholicism and use Paul on their side. But that's what they're doing. They're forcing him into their argument, which he knew nothing about, of course. But before that, it came from the so-called church fathers, who, as I argued in my book, Empire Baptized, and more recently in the shorter version of that, Creation or Empire, needed to claim the traditions of Judaism because in the Roman world, a new idea was suspect. So it's not that they believed in Judaism or wanted to claim that name, but they wanted to claim the roots of that all the way back to Abraham. So the Christian historian Eusebius says that Abraham was the first Christian because of his belief in God. And that kind of imperial colonialization of an indigenous tradition is all too common throughout Roman Christian history, but it has nothing to do with the gospel or what we hear in Acts. So neither on the basis of the church fathers or the Protestant reformers like Luther can we understand that the actual Saul saw an opposition between the traditional Torah from Moses and the gospel of Jesus. He sees them as utterly consistent, and the gospel is the fulfillment of it. In a similar way, number 5, that is, his gospel is substantially different from what we find in the 4 gospels. And we see that sometimes among feminists or other scholars who want to read Paul in his letters as anti-women, taking a couple of passages that certainly sound anti-women, women should be silent in church and things like that, as the core of his message. But more recent scholarship has shown that either Paul didn't say those things, or they've been misunderstood, taken out of context, or even if he meant them as they were in a sexist, misogynist sense, that's only a small piece of his message, in the same way that he didn't challenge the basic tradition of slavery, which nobody challenged at that time and wasn't challenged until relatively recent phenomenon. Even then was very controversial as going against the Bible, which seemed to authorize slavery and does. It talks in various ways about when to treat slaves, but it doesn't challenge the basic notion of slavery. So having gotten those out of the way, in the blue here, I offer just a simple summary of what we do know about him. Saul was a quote-unquote apocalyptic Pharisee, and I put it in quotes because it's not a label anybody used at the time, but in the sense that his experience here is from the other side of the veil. It's a classic apocalyptic experience, like Jesus taking Peter, James, and John up the mountain of transfiguration, where Jesus is transfigured before them, and they hear the voice from the cloud that says, "This is my son, listen to him." So he hears the voice of the Son saying, "Why do you persecute me?" that we'll look at in a minute. So his road to Damascus experience transformed him not from Jew to Christian, not from Torah to gospel, but from the religion of empire to the religion of creation. In other words, he went from using violence to crush opposition to embodying love of enemies and the inclusive message of the gospel, and was willing to take on the violence in his own body, as he reports a number of times, rather than be a violent enforcer himself. So that's a framework to allow us to get into our chapter. And with that in mind, let's just jump right in. And my note below has the chiasm you see, but it continues down to note that our larger plot of Luke's story here in Acts has three threads now. The Hellenists on the road, Philip now up to Caesarea, the apostles keeping watch in Jerusalem, and Saul now on the rampage. Keener notes the issue of the chiasm there in a different way, but we won't go into that now. So, meanwhile, using a phrase that's used 95 times in Acts, hade, but I'm only noticing it now in the text. It's 703 times in the New Testament, but a common transitional phrase. Saul, we see him here for the third time. We saw him back in 758 holding the coats of those who stoned Stephen, and then we saw him right there. And Luke, in a very modern sort of writing way, has set us up with the suspense of him that now is fulfilled. And now we'll see it. But there's also a question of how it's spelled. Here it's spelled Saulos, but we'll see a little later it's spelled Saul. And that's why I put it here in that literal transfiguration spelling. So when it comes from the voice in the sky, and when it's remembering that, it's spelled like the biblical king. Note from my note below that the form we see Saulos here, which we see in 9:1, is only 15 times in the Bible, and they're all in Acts. The other form is 381 times in the Septuagint, but only 9 times in Acts. So that's the very normal way to spell the name of the king in the Greek. And as I was noting, he's not Paul until 13:9. His return brackets the visit of Philip to the Samaritans, anticipating his Gentile mission later. And as Linda Maloney notes, to highlight that I'm not the only one saying this, Paul never refers to himself in past or present tense as Saul, nor does anyone else. Only the author of Acts ever calls him Saul. And I know, well, the risen Jesus does right here. So here he is, still breathing threats and murder. And whether we hear that as two separate things, threats and murder, or hendiadys, murderous threats, you can decide. The word for breathing here, empeneon, is only here in the New Testament. The pneuo is a form of pneuma, like the Spirit, but that word is only here. It's one time in the Septuagint in the Book of Wisdom, contrasting with the later given Holy Spirit. So this is a spirit of threats and murder in contrast with the Holy Spirit. The word for threats, apeles, here, echoing the threats against Peter and the others that we heard in 4:29, only in Ephesians, elsewhere. But the image of breathing threats is several times, and it's all God's breathing threats against people. So here's Saul playing God's role in a sense, but of course in an inverted sense. And it's very clear, threats and murder. It's not just that he wants to silence them, he wants them dead. And we see how zealous that means he is. He could just put them in jail, he could have them just silenced. Notice even the Sanhedrin didn't actually attempt to kill Peter and the others, although they may have been planning to. They in the end didn't do it. And of course in the end he won't do it either. As Walton notes below, Saul is fighting against God, citing 539, Gamaliel's advice of why they shouldn't stop the movement because they may find themselves doing exactly what Saul is doing here. So against the disciples of the Lord. This is the last time this is mentioned as a group, the disciples of the Lord, and the only previous mention was around the time of the Hellenists in chapter 6 when Stephen and Philip and the others were chosen. So disciples will turn up later, but disciples of the Lord is here. Notice not the Christians or anything else like that, but the disciples of the Lord. Acts will never call them Christians. He went to the high priest, and there's a question of who that is, apparently still Annas or Caiaphas. We don't know exactly how much time has gone by since Easter, but it can't have been too long so far. As Keener notes below, the high priest's identity is not relevant to Luke's account. Luke mistrusts the high priestly class as a whole, as we'll see later in Acts. Moreover, in Acts, as noted above, this persecution abroad is Saul's agenda, and the high priest merely approves his initiative. Which leads here in verse 2 to the question I was asking about the authority of the high priest in Jerusalem over the synagogues of Damascus. As Josephus notes in his Antiquities, and you can see the site below, that there's a high priest the authority to follow customs, which may be the basis for Saul's request here, that according to Witherington. And so he asked for letters, and there's an interesting cross-linguistic pun that's not in the text, because the verb for to ask in Hebrew is sha'al. So in the books of Samuel, that's often used as a pun on his name, but it's not in Greek, where the word is itio, and obviously that's not close to Saul. The asked is 10 times in Acts itself. He asked for letters, and this is the first time we're hearing of letters, and there'll be a series of letters. This is highlighting that in the Greco-Roman world, letters were the way people communicated across any kind of distance. Not email, not texting, not Zoom, etc. And you can also imagine what a long period of time that took, especially at a distance. But he's not at a distance. He's in Jerusalem asking them for it, and he can just take those letters with him. So it's not like letters like trying to communicate at a distance. It's like letters of recommendation or letters of authority that's going on here. So, as my note below has, only Acts and, well, the letters use the term epistolos for that. We could look at the letters in the book of Ezra or in the Septuagint in 1st Esdras about royal edicts in Yehud from the Persians, and there's also those in 1st Maccabees, but that would take us pretty far astray. As Cradle notes, since Damascus was outside the jurisdiction of the Jerusalem high priest, Saul would need to attain goodwill of synagogue leaders there, where there was a large Jewish population. But as Luke Johnson notes, it's not at all certain historically that the chief priest had such powers of extradition, which are to say, to take the people out of there and bring them back. And the site to Nehemiah is how Nehemiah, the Persian-appointed governor, had letters from the emperor to support what he was doing there. And he asked for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. And by all scholarly accounts, there was a substantial Jewish population in Damascus. But before we look at Damascus, let's look at synagogues in Acts. We saw the synagogue of the freedmen that were in opposition with Stephen back in chapter 6, and this is only the second time. But I want to highlight this to show how, for those who think that Saul is concerned with Gentiles or has given up on his people, he consistently goes to synagogues throughout the entire book, all the way through. You see how little break there is anywhere in here. Consistently, chapter 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 19, etc., all the way to the end, and then at the end recalling what he's done so far. So he's been in the synagogues all along. But this is synagogues at Damascus. So let's pause for a moment and consider Damascus. Here you can see this map from Google Maps, looking at the distance of how long it would take, by most estimates about 6 days. And if we look at this a little bit closer back, we can see geographically that Damascus sits in this little basin at the base of the mountain, with Mount Hermon to the left and the so-called anti-Lebanon mountains to the north and to the east there, and had an enormous amount of snowmelt and rainfall come down to it. So although it's inland and away from the water and would otherwise be desert, it's known as an urban oasis. And it's the oldest continuous resided-in city in the world, as far as we know, several thousand years, which curiously makes it difficult to know about, because archaeologically, it's been built on and built on and built on and occupied. So just like Jerusalem, it continues to be occupied, but not as long as Damascus. It's hard to know some of the details. But we can know that it was a thriving city and trade, especially in the time of the Persians and after. But during the time after Alexander the Great, when the Ptolemies in Alexandria and the Seleucids in Antioch, not far from Damascus, battled with each other over control of this land, there was a constant going back and forth between them, and Damascus found itself pushed by the wayside. So it was only with the Roman conquest of the Seleucids that Damascus began to make a comeback, starting in 63 BCE. So by the time of our scene, it's been roughly 100 years that Damascus has been rebuilt again and became a stronger place, but an important trade route. So it had a multicultural environment, even more so than Jerusalem, up at the top of a skier mountain like Mount Zion, and found a large number of Jews there. So my notes below from Fitzmyer noting the same point that it lay at the caravan route. As Keener notes, just as Alexandrian Jews had an ethnarch and Nabateans in Damascus had an ethnarch, Damascus Jews would possess a measure of autonomy. But we don't know how much, simply because there's just not much data from that. Both Josephus and Philo testify to substantial numbers of Jews there, although how Philo and Alexandria would know that, it's hard to know. And Keener notes, like most ancient cities, it embraced multiple deities, but Israelites were allowed to practice there like they were in many other cities, including Alexandria. So that's just a little bit about Damascus, although Damascus is not really in the story that much any more than Gaza was in the previous story. So he's on the way there. Why there? It's hard to know, but it's the beginning of taking the gospel north. So to the extent that the previous story went south of Jerusalem in the wilderness and the road to Gaza, and at least alluded to Ethiopia as the ends of the earth to the south, now Damascus begins to take it north. And as we'll see later in the story, Antioch, not far from Damascus, becomes a base point for the community and for Paul and his companions' travels. So his purpose is this. So if he found any, and note the play Risco on found with the theme of finding, seeking and you'll find, or lost and found here. But this is not lost and found, but it is seeking and finding. But he will not find what he's seeking here at all. He'll be stopped before he gets there. So he found any who, note how it's described here. The belonging is not in the Greek. Any of the way. Again, not Christians. They're described in verse 1 as disciples of the Lord, and here as participants in the way. This is the first formal expression of that, and we'll see it a number of times later. But as I was noting, it was implicit in the Ethiopian story, as it was in the Road to Emmaus story, of those things taking place on the way. Keener, in my understanding, reveals how he continues to embody the problem here. And listen to his quote. He says, quote, "The way as a title for the Christian movement appears only in Acts, but probably reflects genuine tradition about one of the movement's titles for itself, probably in a Semitic context." But notice what he's assuming, for the Christian movement. But there's no sense of any Christian movement. As Walton notes, he says the way, quote, is a term that identifies them as a group within Judaism. And that's exactly the point. I just want to say that Keener is just flat wrong on this, despite his thousands of pages of analysis. He just has that presupposition as an evangelical Christian and can't seem to let go of it. I don't know him personally. I'm not going to try to psychologize that. But the fact of the matter is the text never refers to this movement as Christian. So, any who are part of the way, men or women, continuing that theme that we've seen several times, starting with the Joel prophecy fulfillment back in the Pentecost speech, men or women, that he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And the question here is, would these letters entitle him to bring them back? And the reality is, we simply don't know. The argument can be that if these are people who escaped in the diaspora, the scattering, in other words, if these are Jerusalem people who tried to take refuge in Damascus, then they might still be under Jerusalem's jurisdiction. Although we saw the scattering said they were going to Samaria and all the way up to Syria. So there was no evidence from Acts for that people from Jerusalem ended up in Damascus, but it might be, but the text leaves it ambiguous. So that's the setup, and here we go. And my note below has several parallels to other texts that we can see, to the vision of Daniel 10, to a vision in Enoch, to Ezekiel's similar vision, to the call story of Moses in Exodus 3, and then repeated in 4, to Jeremiah's call story, and to another one in Judges. But it also parallels the eunuchs to Gaza. Both have their transformative experiences on the road. And as many scholars have noted, it seems to be parallel to this story in 4 Maccabees, also a first century text, although it's not exactly clear which came first, the story of Simon and Apollonius. And I won't go through the whole story. I'll post it at radicalbible.net. 4 Maccabees is not in the Bible. Only 1st and 2nd Maccabees are part of the Septuagint directly. So this is from a later text, but it's called Maccabees, so sometimes it's included within these collections, about an Apollonius, the governor of Syria, who received a report that there were treasuries in Jerusalem that they might have access to. And so he went up to Seleucus, the king, to receive authority, but the people were opposed to him. And then he has this experience with angels on horseback. Notice not even he's on horseback, but angels on horseback with lightning flashing, much like that flashing here, that change him. And whether that's meant to be parallel to this, it's hard to know. Apollonius is hardly a character. The Luke want to say, remember the story of Apollonius, and perhaps the two texts are simultaneous, so it's hard to know which one came first. But many scholars want to point out that parallel, so there it is now. You've seen it too. So as he was going along, and notice at this point we'd have no idea there's anybody else with him, just like on his other travels, we can't always tell if there's a big crowd, even though sometimes he names a particular person like Barnabas or Silas who are with him. But here we might imagine he was by himself, but in a moment we'll hear he's not. So the basis for that is it isolates him for the camera view, so to speak. So as he was going along and approaching Damascus, coming near it like Peter to Joppa, where he has a vision in chapter 10, and the recollection of this later, suddenly, well, I'm not using idu, behold, but using a word we only hear one other time, we're calling this here. As my note has below, the Greek word order is even more dramatic, placing ek to orano, out of the sky or out of heaven, at the end of the sentence. And we don't have to hear it from heaven, we just have to hear it from sky, because orano is the sky. It's a light from the sky, flashed around him. Is that meant to be lightning? Well, we don't know if there's clouds or it's a clear blue sky. This is an area that doesn't get a lot of rain, but we don't know exactly what time of year it is. Certainly the story started with Pentecost, but certainly much time has passed, so we really don't know that now. As Tannehill notes below, the one who is called to be a light to the nations and to open the eyes of Jews and Gentiles has encountered the Messiah in light, and it is himself a healed blind man, forced by the Messiah's light to recognize his own blindness and to receive his sight through him. And isn't that a nice summary of that? So it flashed around him. The word for flash, peristrepsin, only in the recollection telling the story here, as Trainer notes, incorporates the Greek root for lightning, astrope, and star, aster. This is an experience of heavenly divine origin that brings Saul literally to the earth. He fell to the earth. So this flashing from the sky brings him to the earth, and the note below is at the parallel I was noting. I know I'm going a little long here, but we have to at least get through this part of it here. As B. Wilson notes, in this one-on-one contest of power, Jesus clearly comes out on top, for the light and presumably voice comes from heaven, and Saul falls to the earth. Saul, the single most persistent persecutor of Jesus, is literally brought down. And here it is. He fell not to the ground, but to the earth, like Abraham in Genesis 17 and others that we see along the way. Again, recalling many instances of people experiencing God and falling to the ground or to the earth. And he heard a voice saying, and we know we won't get to it today, but we will next time, that the people who are with him have a little different experience, and so we'll explore that next time. Heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, with the Aramaic spelling transliterated. And my note below is the issue I was making about the question of his name and the relationship with the king and with his Judaism. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Diocase, or pursue me, as we saw in 752, that set up the scattering. As Willie Jennings notes, there is no rationale for killing that remains intact in the presence of God. The power of this event almost overwhelms its textual witness. Luke is handling holy fire now. The question comes directly to Saul. This is a question too massive for him to handle because it's an intimate one. Why are you hurting me? And he asked, who are you, Lord or Sir? A parallel to Moses at the burning bush. And again, scholars want to argue about whether this is Lord or Sir, but it's both. As Luke Johnson notes, there's something terrible and inexorable about the flashing light and the probing voice. Paul, as he says here, needs to ask, who is this Lord? But he knows at once that it is Lord, the commanding transcendent power of God. But that's assuming the translation. It could also be Sir, but certainly if you hear a voice from the sky, you presume it's not just a Sir. And the reply came, and literally, and then, ego eimi, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. The ego eimi will come in various forms, as we'll see. That's the voice of Yahweh at the burning bush as well, whom you are persecuting. And therefore, the first time we hear that the community, the ecclesia, is the body of Christ. And the instructions that come at the center of the chiasm we'll get to next time. See you then. Bye-bye.